You think saying, "I don't belong to anyone" makes you safe? Logan Carter said without looking up, his voice calm like a loaded weapon set on a table no one dared touch. The rain outside the penthouse windows blurred the city into streaks of light, as Emily Harper stood near the entrance still holding her coat, still deciding if she had made a mistake coming here. She had been called a waitress too many times today, as if the word itself defined the limits of her existence. But she didn't correct him. She simply replied, "I think belonging is something people choose, not something they're assigned." That made him pause, just for a second, long enough for the room to notice the shift. Logan finally looked at her, really looked, like she was a variable he hadn't accounted for in a calculation he trusted. "You work in a place where people tip you for existing," he said, standing now, closing the distance between them without urgency, only certainty. "And you're talking about choice." Emily didn't step back. That was the first thing he noticed that didn't fit his expectations. Most people adjusted themselves around him, lowered their voice, softened their edges, but she stayed the same height in the air between them. "I serve tables," she said quietly, "not my value." A silence followed that felt heavier than the storm outside. Somewhere behind him, a glass clinked, a reminder that his world was built on precision, control, and unspoken rules. Logan tilted his head slightly, as if recalibrating her place in his mind. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, not as a threat, but as a test. Emily's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, and you don't scare me." That was the moment everything shifted, because no one had ever said that to him and meant it. Logan exhaled slowly, almost amused, but something in his eyes tightened like a locked door finding pressure from the inside. "You should," he said softly, though even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Outside, thunder rolled across the skyline, and for the first time in years, Logan Carter realized he wasn't controlling the conversation anymore, and Emily Harper had not come here to be chosen, but to be understood. Logan Carter did not respond right away. He had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than pressure ever could. So he simply watched Emily Harper as she stood in the middle of his penthouse like she did not belong to the room, and the room did not belong to her either. Outside, the city continued its endless motion beneath a sky heavy with rain, but inside everything felt paused, suspended between what he expected and what she refused to become. Emily finally set her coat down on the back of a chair without asking permission, a small act that should have meant nothing but somehow shifted the balance in the room again. One of Logan's advisors, standing near the far end of the table, cleared his throat and reminded him softly that the contract meeting was scheduled in less than an hour, but Logan did not move. Instead, he asked, "Where did you learn to speak like that?" Emily glanced toward him, not impressed by the question, only honest in her answer. "From being told my entire life that I would not matter unless I accepted it." That answer lingered longer than he expected. Most people he encountered tried to impress him or avoid him, but she did neither. She simply existed without permission. Logan turned slightly toward the glass wall overlooking the city, his reflection merging with the skyline, and for a moment, he looked less like a man in control and more like someone trying to understand a problem that did not follow his rules. "You understand what this world is," he said finally, his tone measured, almost instructional. "Everything here has a cost." Emily walked a few steps closer, stopping at a distance that felt intentional rather than cautious. "Then maybe the question is not what I cost," she replied, "but what you assume people are worth before you ever ask." That sentence disrupted something subtle in him. Logan was used to negotiations, to leverage, to conversations where value was calculated instantly, but she was speaking in a language that did not fit any of that. The advisor at the table shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the meeting they were waiting for had already started without them. Logan raised a hand slightly, signaling for silence, and the room obeyed. Then, unexpectedly, he asked her, "If you are so certain of yourself, why are you working as a waitress in a place like that?" Emily did not hesitate. "Because survival is not a question of pride," she said. "It is a question of persistence." For the first time that evening, Logan looked away first, not because he was losing control, but because he was recognizing something he did not have a name for yet. A few seconds passed before he spoke again, his voice quieter now. "You are not what I expected," he admitted. Emily tilted her head slightly. "And you are exactly what I expected," she said. That should have ended the conversation, but instead it deepened it. Logan stepped closer, stopping just outside her personal space, and lowered his voice as if the city itself might be listening. "People who think they understand me usually make mistakes," he said. Emily's reply came without fear. "Then maybe you are the one making them first." The air between them changed again, not into tension, but into something harder to define, like two realities colliding without deciding which one would remain. And for Logan Carter, who had built his entire life on certainty, that uncertainty was the first thing he could not afford to ignore. The next morning arrived with a gray light pressing against the glass walls of Logan Carter's penthouse, but the atmosphere inside remained unchanged, still charged with the unresolved tension from the night before. Emily Harper had not left yet, not because she was asked to stay, but because no one had told her to leave, and she had decided long ago that she would not move through life based on silent expectations. Logan stood near a long black table surrounded by his advisors, reviewing documents that meant millions of dollars and countless decisions that shaped entire networks of power, yet his attention drifted back to the fact that she was sitting quietly near the window, observing the city as if it did not intimidate her the way it intimidated most people. One of the advisors finally spoke, reminding Logan that the contract negotiations with the Rossi family required immediate confirmation, but Logan raised a hand without looking away from Emily, signaling that it could wait. That simple gesture unsettled the room more than any spoken command could have. Emily noticed it, of course, because she noticed everything, and she finally turned her head slightly. "You are avoiding your own world because of me," she said calmly, not as an accusation, but as an observation. Logan's expression did not change, but his voice lowered when he replied, "You are not significant enough to make me avoid anything." The words should have ended the exchange, but they did not, because neither of them believed in surface-level truths anymore. Emily stood and walked toward the table, stopping just outside its edge, her presence refusing to be absorbed into the space he controlled. "Then stop looking at me," she said. "If I am irrelevant, your attention is inefficient." A faint shift passed through the advisors, subtle but noticeable, because no one spoke to Logan Carter in terms of efficiency when it came to his attention. Logan studied her for a long moment before dismissing the room with a quiet gesture. The advisors hesitated but eventually left, closing the doors behind them, leaving only silence and the weight of two opposing perspectives. When the room was empty, Logan finally spoke again, this time without pretense. "You adapt quickly," he said. Emily nodded slightly. "Adaptation is what people call survival when they do not want to admit it is necessity." Logan stepped away from the table, slowly reducing the distance between them again. But this time the movement felt less like dominance and more like curiosity he had not intended to show. "You understand that people in my position do not engage in uncertainty," he said. Emily tilted her head. "Then you should not be speaking to me." A faint pause followed, one that stretched longer than either of them expected. Logan finally exhaled, a controlled release of something that did not fully surface. "I am offering you a structured arrangement," he said, his tone returning to something more familiar, more calculated. "A marriage contract in name and function. It solves several obligations for my family, and it provides you financial stability beyond anything you currently have." The words hung in the air like an equation waiting for interpretation. Emily did not react immediately, and that silence alone made Logan realize she was not evaluating the money. She was evaluating him. "And what do you gain?" she asked finally. Logan answered without hesitation. "Control of expectations, stability in public perception, and a solution to variables that are becoming inefficient." Emily took a slow breath, as if weighing something far beyond the room itself. "You talk about people like they are systems," she said softly. "But systems do not look back at you." Logan's gaze sharpened slightly at that, not offended, but challenged in a way he was not accustomed to. For the first time, his answer was not immediate. Emily turned away first, walking back toward the window, leaving the question suspended between them. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware that inside a single decision had begun forming something neither of them fully understood yet, something that would not remain theoretical for long. Logan Carter did not answer right away, because the problem in front of him was no longer a contract or a negotiation, but something far less predictable, Emily Harper standing by the window, as if she had already decided the outcome before he even spoke. The morning light softened the edges of the room, but it did nothing to soften the distance between their perspectives. Logan finally closed the folder in front of him, the sound controlled, precise, and intentional, before he spoke in a lower tone. "You are treating this as if it is a philosophical debate," he said. "It is not. It is logistics." Emily turned slowly from the window, her expression calm but unyielding. "That is your mistake," she replied. "You think everything important can be reduced to logistics." Logan stepped closer, stopping a few feet away, close enough that the conversation no longer felt like it belonged to a boardroom or a negotiation table. "You have no experience in my world," he said. "You are making assumptions based on emotion." Emily nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the statement without accepting its weight. "And you are making decisions based on control," she said. "We are not that different." That sentence caused a subtle shift in his expression, not agreement, but recalibration, as if he was reprocessing a variable he had previously dismissed. A soft knock interrupted the moment, and one of Logan's assistants entered briefly with a tablet, hesitating before speaking. "The Rossi confirmation is required within the hour," he said carefully. Logan did not look away from Emily when he responded. "Extend it." The assistant paused, clearly surprised, but left without further question. Emily noticed everything, including that Logan had just delayed a decision worth millions of dollars without hesitation. "You are not acting like yourself," she said quietly. Logan turned slightly toward her, his tone steady but quieter now. "You are not qualified to define what myself is," he replied. Emily took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to challenge the space between them without crossing it. "Then explain it," she said. "If everything is about efficiency and control, why am I still here?" Logan did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched longer than any command he had ever issued. Instead, he walked past her toward the glass wall, looking down at the city below, where thousands of lives moved without knowing the decisions being made above them. "Because your presence creates a variable I cannot categorize," he said finally. Emily tilted her head slightly. "That sounds like a problem you want to solve," she said. Logan's reflection in the glass showed no immediate reaction, but his voice was lower when he responded. "It is a problem I cannot ignore." Another pause followed, heavier than the last. Emily walked back toward the center of the room, picking up the contract folder he had left open earlier, scanning it briefly before placing it back down. "This document treats marriage like a transaction," she said. "But you are asking me to agree to something that changes every part of my life." Logan turned back toward her. "It changes nothing unless you allow it to," he said. Emily met his gaze directly. "That is where you are wrong," she replied. The air between them tightened again, not in conflict, but in recognition that neither of them was willing to step backward. Logan studied her for a long moment, then spoke in a quieter tone than before. "If you refuse, nothing changes for me," he said. Emily answered without hesitation. "Then you should not be so focused on whether I accept." That statement lingered, cutting through his certainty in a way no one had managed before. For the first time, Logan Carter did not immediately redirect the conversation, and in that brief silence, the foundation of the decision between them began to shift in a direction neither of them had fully chosen yet. Logan Carter did not move for several seconds after Emily Harper's last words, because something unfamiliar had settled in the space between them, not agreement and not conflict, but the uncomfortable realization that neither of them was willing to yield ground. The city outside the glass walls continued its indifferent rhythm, but inside the penthouse, every detail felt sharper, as if the air itself had adjusted to the presence of a decision not yet made. Logan finally turned away from the window, his voice calm again, but lower than before. "You are correct about one thing," he said. "This arrangement is not just about efficiency anymore." Emily watched him carefully, not reacting immediately, because she had learned that powerful people often revealed more in what they changed than in what they said. Logan walked toward the table and placed his hand on the contract folder again, not opening it, only acknowledging its presence. "There are expectations beyond business," he continued. "My family requires stability. Public perception requires alignment. And certain obligations require resolution within a controlled structure." Emily crossed her arms lightly, her expression steady but attentive. And you believe I am the solution to all of that, she said. Logan met her gaze directly. I believe you are the most rational option available, he replied without hesitation. The word rational hung in the air longer than intended, because it reduced her to a category she clearly did not accept. Emily stepped closer to the table, looking down at the contract, then back at him. Rational does not mean right, she said. Logan exhaled slowly, as if that distinction was one he had heard before but rarely considered relevant. A soft chime from his phone interrupted the moment, and when he glanced at it, his expression shifted slightly, not in emotion, but in focus. He turned the screen briefly toward her. It displayed a notification regarding a scheduled meeting at the restaurant where she worked. Emily recognized the name instantly. Why is that on your calendar? She asked. Logan answered without looking away from the device. Because I do not enter agreements without understanding every variable involved. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. So this is not a conversation. It is an evaluation. Logan paused for a fraction of a second before replying. It is both. Later that evening, Emily returned to the restaurant where she worked, the familiar noise of clinking glass and soft conversations grounding her in a reality that felt increasingly separate from the world she had just left. She moved between tables with practiced precision, carrying trays and responding to requests with the same controlled calm she always had, but her mind was no longer fully anchored in routine. At table 7, a group of guests spoke too loudly about investments and acquisitions, but she ignored them as she always did, until one of them mentioned a name she now recognized. Logan Carter. She paused briefly, then continued serving without reaction, but the mention lingered. From across the room, she felt it before she saw it, the sense of being observed rather than watched. When she finally turned slightly, she saw him seated at a corner table, not surrounded by noise or attention, but positioned as if he belonged anywhere he chose to be. He did not signal her. He did not interrupt her work. He simply observed, as he had done before, but now in a different setting, one that placed her back in the environment he had originally labeled as ordinary. When her shift ended hours later, she found him waiting near the exit, not blocking her path, only present. You are following me now, she said calmly. Logan corrected her without hesitation. I am understanding context, he replied. Emily studied him for a moment, then adjusted her bag on her shoulder. And what context did you find? She asked. Logan's answer was simple, but deliberate. That your world is smaller than it should be for someone who refuses to be defined by it. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she stepped past him, pausing only long enough to speak without turning back. Then you are looking in the wrong direction, she said softly. And for the first time, Logan did not immediately counter her statement, because something about the way she said it suggested that the real misunderstanding had not yet been revealed. Logan Carter remained still long after Emily Harper disappeared into the flow of the city outside the restaurant, because something about the interaction had not resolved in the way he expected, as if every answer she gave only created a deeper layer of questions he had not planned to ask. The night air outside the restaurant was cool, carrying the distant sound of traffic and footsteps, but Logan did not immediately leave. Instead, he stood near the entrance, observing the space where she had just been, not as a loss, but as an unfinished equation. Inside, Emily continued her shift, moving between tables with steady precision, but there was a subtle difference now in the way she carried herself, not uncertainty, but awareness, as if she could feel the presence of a variable that did not belong to her usual environment. Logan finally stepped away from the entrance and walked along the sidewalk, his mind replaying her words from earlier, especially the way she had refused to define herself within the boundaries he had unconsciously assumed. It was not resistance that unsettled him, but consistency, because she did not shift depending on his status, his tone, or his influence. That was uncommon. Later that night, Emily exited through the back door of the restaurant, pulling her jacket tighter as she stepped into the alley behind the building. The city lights reflected faintly on the wet pavement, and she adjusted her bag as she prepared for the short walk to the subway station. She had done this routine hundreds of times before, but tonight the silence felt different, more aware, like something in the environment had changed without visible cause. As she turned the corner, she stopped abruptly. Logan Carter was standing near the edge of the street, not blocking her path, but positioned in a way that suggested he had already determined this moment would occur. "You are not very subtle," she said calmly, not surprised, but acknowledging. Logan responded without hesitation. "Subtlety is not required when outcomes are predictable," he said. Emily tilted her head slightly. "And I am predictable?" she asked. Logan studied her for a moment before replying. "No," he said. "That is the issue." The simplicity of the answer created a pause between them, heavier than expected. Emily adjusted her bag again, then began walking past him, but Logan spoke once more without raising his voice. "Your environment is limiting your potential variables," he said. Emily stopped, but did not turn around immediately. "You are talking about my life like it is a system you can optimize," she replied. Logan stepped slightly closer, still maintaining distance, but reducing the space between their perspectives. "Every system can be improved if the correct inputs are identified," he said. Emily finally turned to face him fully. "And you think I am an input?" she said. Logan did not deny it immediately, which was answer enough in itself. Then he spoke again, more carefully this time. "I think you are an anomaly," he said. That word lingered longer than anything else he had said so far. Emily looked at him for a moment, then exhaled slowly, as if processing something she had already suspected. "Anomalies are usually removed or ignored," she said. Logan's expression remained controlled, but his voice lowered slightly. "Not always," he replied. A distant car passed, headlights briefly illuminating both of them before fading into the street. Emily stepped forward, closing the distance just enough to be heard clearly over the city noise. "If you are trying to control this situation," she said, "you are already failing." Logan's gaze remained steady. "I am not trying to control you," he said. Emily nodded slightly. "That is the first thing you have said tonight that I believe," she replied. The silence that followed was not empty, but layered, as if both of them were recognizing that the structure they had assumed was forming between them was already changing shape without permission. Logan finally looked away toward the street, not in dismissal, but in recalculation, as Emily continued walking forward, leaving him standing with a realization he did not yet have a name for. Logan Carter did not leave the street immediately after Emily Harper walked away, because for the first time in years, his decision-making process had slowed in a way that did not feel strategic but reflective, as if every assumption he had relied on was being quietly reorganized by a presence he could no longer categorize. The city continued its steady rhythm around him, headlights passing in controlled streams, distant conversations fading into the night air, but his attention remained fixed on the direction she had gone, not as pursuit, but as unresolved structure. He finally stepped into his vehicle but did not start the engine right away, instead sitting in silence with both hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying her words from earlier with unusual precision. She had not argued for attention, nor had she attempted to influence his decisions through emotion or leverage. She had simply resisted classification. That distinction stayed with him longer than expected. Meanwhile, Emily continued walking toward the subway station, her pace steady, her expression controlled, but her thoughts increasingly aware that the boundaries of her ordinary life were no longer behaving normally. The familiar sounds of the city, the distant rumble of trains, and the low conversations of strangers around her no longer felt entirely separate from the encounter she had just left behind. When she reached the station entrance, she paused briefly before descending the stairs, instinctively scanning the environment as if something subtle had changed in how the world responded to her presence. At the top of the stairs, she noticed a black vehicle parked across the street, stationary but positioned in a way that suggested observation rather than coincidence. And although she did not react outwardly, she registered the implication internally without assigning it immediate meaning. Back inside Logan Carter's world, his assistant sent a message regarding the postponed negotiation with the Rossi family, but Logan did not respond immediately. Instead, he opened a secure file containing background information on Emily Harper, only to find that the data was incomplete in ways that should not have been possible given his usual access. Her work history was straightforward, her financial profile consistent with expectations, but there were gaps in her social and personal records that did not align with standard documentation patterns. Logan stared at the screen longer than usual, not because of concern, but because inconsistency was rare in systems he controlled. Later that night, Emily returned to her small apartment. a modest space that reflected years of structured independence, and she set her bag down before removing her jacket, exhaling slowly as she attempted to return to normal rhythm. However, when she checked her phone, she found a missed call from an unknown number with no message attached. She did not return it, but she also did not delete it. Instead, she placed the phone face down and moved to prepare a simple meal, attempting to restore predictability through routine action. Hours later, as the city quieted, Logan found himself still awake in his penthouse, standing near the glass wall again, observing the distant pattern of lights below. His advisors had long since left, his scheduled meetings had been postponed, and yet his focus remained unresolved. He finally spoke aloud, though no one was present to respond. "She does not behave like a variable," he said quietly, as if confirming something he had been avoiding articulating. Emily, in her apartment, paused briefly while turning off her kitchen light, as if sensing something she could not explain, then continued moving through her space with measured calm. In both environments, separated by distance and circumstance, the same realization began forming without permission, not as conclusion, but as instability, because Logan Carter had spent his entire life controlling outcomes, and Emily Harper had just become the first element he could not predict, contain, or comfortably define. Logan Carter stood alone in his penthouse long after midnight, the city below him glowing in silent motion. But his attention was no longer on the skyline or the endless structure of power he had built his life around, because every thought now returned to Emily Harper with a persistence he could not dismiss or reframe as logic. On the glass wall, his reflection appeared controlled, composed, familiar, yet the thoughts behind it were no longer aligned with his usual precision. He had faced negotiations, betrayals, and strategic instability before, but none of those situations had ever created hesitation in his ability to categorize outcomes. Emily Harper did not fit into any category he trusted. At the same time, across the city in her small apartment, Emily sat quietly on the edge of her bed, her hands resting still, her posture composed, but her thoughts moving in a direction she had not invited. The missed call from earlier remained on her phone, untouched, as if acknowledging it would give it meaning it had not yet earned. She exhaled slowly and stood, moving to the window, looking out at the distant city lights, unaware that somewhere in that same expanse, Logan Carter was doing the same. The difference was not in what they were seeing, but in how the existence of the other had begun to reshape interpretation itself. In Logan's world, early the next morning, his advisors gathered again around the long table, expecting direction regarding delayed negotiations and unresolved agreements. But Logan remained standing near the glass, silent longer than usual. One of the advisors finally spoke carefully, reminding him that postponement would affect multiple financial structures across 3 separate regions. Logan acknowledged the statement without turning around, then responded in a controlled voice. "Restructure the timeline," he said. The room reacted subtly, because Logan Carter did not delay timelines without cause. No one questioned him further, but the shift was noticeable. After the meeting, Logan reviewed Emily Harper's file again, this time focusing not on what was present but on what was missing. Her records still contained gaps that should not exist, and while there was no immediate threat implied, the inconsistency itself had become the subject of his attention. He closed the file after several minutes and leaned back slightly, exhaling once, as if concluding that traditional evaluation methods were no longer sufficient. Later that day, Emily returned to work at the restaurant, moving through familiar tasks with practiced efficiency, but the environment felt subtly different, not because anything had changed physically, but because her awareness had expanded beyond the boundaries of routine. She noticed small details she would normally ignore, the timing of entrances, the positioning of patrons, the subtle pauses in conversation when certain names were mentioned. Logan Carter's name was not spoken again, but its absence from discussion felt intentional rather than coincidental. As her shift progressed, she found herself briefly glancing toward the entrance more than once, a habit she did not consciously recognize forming. When she finished work that evening, she exited through the back again, but this time she paused before stepping into the alley. The street beyond was quiet, but not empty in the way it usually felt. There was a presence to the space, not visible, but implied, like structure waiting for acknowledgement. She walked forward anyway, maintaining her usual pace, refusing to alter behavior based on uncertainty alone. At the same moment, Logan Carter was in transit, seated in the back of a vehicle moving through the city, reviewing a set of meeting notes that he had already memorized. Yet his attention was divided, not by distraction, but by recurrence. Every conclusion he attempted to reach regarding Emily Harper returned incomplete, as if the data itself refused finalization. When his vehicle passed the restaurant, he did not instruct it to stop, but his gaze shifted briefly toward the entrance as it moved past, registering the location without verbal acknowledgement. Emily, several blocks away, paused again at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, and for a brief moment, she looked in the direction of the same passing vehicle without knowing why. Neither of them spoke, neither of them acted beyond routine movement, but something between them had already begun to behave like continuity rather than coincidence. And for Logan Carter, who had built his entire existence on predictable systems, that continuity was no longer an observation. It was becoming an unresolved condition he could not yet name. Logan Carter arrived at the meeting location earlier than scheduled, yet for the first time in years, he did not immediately step inside. The building was one of his controlled properties, a place where decisions were usually finalized without hesitation. But today he stood near the entrance longer than necessary, his attention briefly distracted by the flow of people passing by who had no awareness of the structures operating above their lives. Inside, his advisors were already waiting, prepared with reports, projections, and outcomes, but Logan remained still for several seconds before entering, as if recalibrating something internal that no longer responded to his usual precision. When he finally walked in, the room quieted instantly, not from fear, but from recognition of authority. He took his seat at the head of the table, but instead of immediately addressing the agenda, he paused, scanning the documents in front of him without engaging. One of the advisors began speaking about financial restructuring tied to delayed negotiations, but Logan interrupted without raising his voice. "Postpone all non-essential decisions until further notice," he said. The advisor hesitated. "Sir, that includes 3 international agreements," he replied. Logan did not look up. "They will remain stable," he said simply. The room exchanged subtle glances, because stability was not something Logan Carter typically delegated without active oversight. After a moment of silence, the meeting continued, but the structure had already shifted. Meanwhile, Emily Harper stood in the break room of the restaurant, reading a schedule she had already memorized, yet her focus was elsewhere. The missed call from days earlier remained unanswered, but its existence had begun to feel less like an isolated event and more like part of a pattern she could not yet fully recognize. Her coworker mentioned casually that a black vehicle had been seen near the alley entrance during closing hours, but the comment was not treated as significant. Emily acknowledged it without reaction, though internally she registered the timing as unusual. She returned to work without changing her routine, serving tables, clearing dishes, responding to requests with calm efficiency, but something subtle had changed in the way she observed the environment. She noticed pauses in conversations that were slightly too long, glances that ended too quickly, and a general awareness of space that felt newly structured rather than random. At the same time, Logan ended his meeting earlier than planned, dismissing the room with minimal explanation. His advisors did not question him, but the adjustment in his schedule created a visible disruption in the usual flow of operations. As he exited the building, his assistant attempted to confirm the next engagement, but Logan responded only with a single instruction. "Clear the afternoon," he said. The assistant hesitated. "There are no unassigned blocks until tomorrow morning," he replied. Logan paused briefly. "Then create one," he said. He entered his vehicle, and instead of directing it toward his residence, he provided an address that was not part of his official itinerary. It was the location of the restaurant where Emily Harper worked. He did not announce his intention to anyone, nor did he frame it as a decision requiring justification. It was simply movement toward a point that had begun occupying more of his attention than any scheduled obligation. When he arrived, he did not immediately enter. Instead, he remained inside the vehicle, observing through the tinted glass as staff moved in and out of the building, unaware of his presence. Emily was inside, unaware as well, continuing her shift with the same measured discipline she always maintained. But Logan's attention was no longer focused on the structure of the business or the efficiency of the environment. It was directed toward one variable within it that refused to stabilize in his mind. After several minutes, he stepped out of the vehicle and approached the entrance, not as an interruption, but as a continuation of something that had not yet been defined. Inside, Emily moved past a table, briefly glancing toward the entrance as if sensing a shift in atmosphere, though she did not yet see him. Logan stopped just outside the glass door, his reflection overlapping the interior space. And for a moment he remained there, not entering, not leaving, simply observing the threshold between two worlds that had begun to overlap in ways neither system could fully explain. And for the first time, Logan Carter did not treat that observation as a problem to solve, but as something he could no longer ignore. Logan Carter remained standing for a moment longer than anyone inside the restaurant could reasonably notice. Yet inside that brief pause, something irreversible had already begun forming, not as intention but as recognition that the boundary between observation and participation had collapsed without permission. Through the glass, he could see Emily Harper moving between tables with steady precision, balancing trays, responding to customers, maintaining the same controlled rhythm she always used, but now every movement appeared differently to him, not as routine labor, but as structure under strain that refused to reveal its limits. He finally entered the restaurant without announcement, without escort, and without the usual presence of advisors or security that typically followed him into any controlled environment. The shift was immediate but subtle, like air pressure changing when a door opens in a sealed room. Emily noticed it almost instantly, not because she had been looking for him, but because awareness had become unavoidable whenever he was near. She continued her work without interruption, placing orders on tables, acknowledging requests, maintaining professional composure, but her path subtly adjusted in ways she did not consciously choose, as if distance itself had begun responding to him. Logan did not approach her directly at first. Instead, he moved slowly through the space, observing without disrupting, noting how others reacted to his presence without knowing why they reacted at all. Conversations lowered slightly, movements became more deliberate, and even the staff seemed to recalibrate their behavior without instruction. Emily finally stopped near the service station, setting down a tray before turning her head just enough to confirm what she already knew. Logan stood several feet away, not intruding on her space, but fully present within it. "You are inside my restaurant now," she said calmly, not as accusation, but as recognition of imbalance. Logan responded without hesitation. "It is a public establishment," he said. Emily nodded slightly. "That is not what I meant," she replied. A brief silence formed between them, one that did not belong to the surrounding noise of the restaurant, as if their conversation had created its own isolated frame within the room. Logan finally stepped closer, stopping at a distance that respected physical boundaries but not conceptual ones. "Your schedule is consistent," he said. "Your patterns are predictable." Emily tilted her head slightly, not offended, but attentive. "And yet you are here," she replied. That statement paused him for a fraction longer than usual. Logan did not immediately respond, because the observation was accurate in a way that bypassed his usual analytical framing. Instead, he looked briefly toward the surrounding tables, then back at her. "I am here because I needed clarity," he said. Emily exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly. "Clarity about what?" she asked. Logan did not answer immediately, and that silence carried further than expected, because for the first time his response did not arrive in structured form. Instead, he observed her again, not as an anomaly this time, but as continuity, something that remained consistent regardless of environment or pressure. "You do not behave like others in your position," he finally said. Emily replied without hesitation. "Because I do not define myself by positions." Logan's gaze held steady. "That is not a practical approach to stability," he said. Emily placed a hand lightly on the counter beside her, grounding herself within the space. "Stability is not always the same as control," she said. Another pause followed, and in that pause the restaurant seemed to return to normal activity around them, yet nothing within their immediate exchange returned to normal framing. Logan finally spoke again, quieter than before. "I have observed that your environment does not reflect your consistency," he said. Emily looked at him directly. And your environment reflects nothing except what you allow it to reflect, she replied. That exchange did not resolve anything, but it altered something in the space between them, because neither of them stepped back from it. Logan Carter, who had always relied on structured interpretation, now found himself standing in a situation that did not simplify with proximity or explanation, and Emily Harper, who had always maintained control through independence, now stood in front of something that did not behave like influence, pressure, or expectation. It simply remained present, unchanged by either of them, and for the first time, Logan did not attempt to categorize what that meant. Logan Carter did not immediately leave the restaurant after Emily Harper's last response, because something in the exchange had created a rare condition in his decision-making process, not confusion, but persistence without resolution, as if the system he trusted no longer produced a final output. He stood near the entrance for several seconds, observing the interior with the same controlled awareness he applied to negotiations, yet this environment refused to behave like a system. Emily continued her work inside, moving between tables with measured precision, but her awareness of him remained constant even when she did not look in his direction. Eventually, Logan stepped back outside, but instead of leaving, he remained near the building, positioned in a way that suggested neither surveillance nor departure, but continuation. Inside, Emily finished serving a table and returned to the service counter, where one of her co-workers mentioned casually that the man near the entrance had been there for several minutes, without speaking to anyone. Emily did not respond immediately, but she registered the information with quiet acknowledgement, because silence in certain contexts was rarely neutral. When her shift finally ended, she exited through the back as usual, adjusting her jacket against the night air, but she paused almost immediately after stepping outside. Logan Carter was there again, not blocking her path, not closing distance unnecessarily, but positioned with deliberate stillness that made avoidance irrelevant rather than required. Emily exhaled slowly, then spoke first. "You are not here by coincidence anymore," she said. Logan responded without hesitation. "I stopped using coincidence as an explanation a long time ago," he replied. Emily nodded slightly, then continued walking forward, expecting him to match her movement or interrupt it, but he did neither. Instead, he walked beside her at a measured distance, maintaining presence without intrusion. The city around them continued its normal rhythm, but their movement created a separate layer of attention that did not belong to the environment. After several steps, Emily finally spoke again. "If this is about evaluation, you have already gathered enough data," she said. Logan glanced toward her briefly. "I do not rely solely on data anymore," he replied. That statement created a pause between them, longer than expected, because it contradicted the foundation of how he normally operated. Emily slowed slightly, then stopped at the corner near the crosswalk. Logan stopped as well, maintaining distance but not separation. "That is a significant change in methodology," she said. Logan did not correct her wording. Instead, he answered honestly. "It is an adjustment I did not plan for," he said. Emily turned to face him fully now, her expression calm but focused. "Then you should determine whether it is beneficial or disruptive," she said. Logan considered the question, but did not respond immediately, because neither classification felt accurate. Instead, he observed her again, noticing not change but consistency, the same steadiness regardless of context or pressure. "It does not fit either category," he finally said. Emily nodded once. "Then it is neither of your categories," she replied. The crosswalk's signal changed, but neither of them moved immediately, as if movement itself required a conclusion neither was willing to define yet. After a moment, Logan spoke again, quieter than before. "Your life remains unchanged despite proximity to influence," he said. Emily responded without hesitation. "Because I do not allow proximity to redefine me," she said. Logan looked toward the street, then back at her. "Most people do not maintain that distinction," he said. Emily stepped forward onto the crosswalk as the signal allowed movement, continuing without waiting for agreement. Logan followed at the same pace, not leading, not trailing, but aligned in distance that neither of them had explicitly agreed upon. As they crossed, the city lights reflected across the wet pavement, and for the first time, Logan Carter did not attempt to interpret the situation in terms of control or outcome, because what was developing between them no longer behaved like either. Logan Carter and Emily Harper continued walking across the intersection even after the signal changed again behind them, as if neither of them had fully acknowledged that their movement had already shifted from coincidence into continuation. The city around them remained loud and indifferent, cars passing in controlled streams of light, pedestrians moving in separate directions without awareness of the silent alignment forming between two people who should not have been walking together at all. Logan finally spoke first, his voice measured, not interrupting their pace. "You are still not reacting the way most people would," he said. Emily kept her gaze forward. "Most people are not used to being observed without being reduced," she replied. That answer did not produce an immediate response from him, because it did not require correction or disagreement. Instead, it introduced another layer of observation that he could not dismiss as emotional interpretation. They reached the opposite side of the street and slowed naturally without agreement, as if both had reached the same unspoken boundary. Logan glanced briefly at her before speaking again. "Your consistency remains unchanged across different environments," he said. Emily nodded slightly. "Because environments do not define me," she replied. Logan looked ahead for a moment, then back at her. "They define most outcomes I have studied," he said. Emily turned her head slightly now, acknowledging the distinction. "Then you are studying the wrong variable," she said. That sentence lingered longer than the others, not because it was aggressive, but because it reframed the entire structure of his observation. They walked another few steps in silence before Logan stopped near the edge of a quieter street. Emily stopped as well, not mirroring him, but not avoiding him either. "You are not afraid of proximity," he said finally. Emily responded without hesitation. "Proximity only matters when you believe it changes who you are," she said. Logan studied her for a moment longer than usual, then spoke in a lower tone. "It changes outcomes," he said. Emily shook her head slightly. "Only if you allow it to define direction," she replied. A brief pause followed, heavier than the previous ones, because neither of them was correcting the other anymore, only refining perspective without convergence. Logan finally stepped closer, not closing distance completely, but reducing the space between them to something more deliberate than before. "I have spent years ensuring outcomes remain within control parameters," he said. Emily looked at him directly. "And yet you are here," she replied. Logan did not answer immediately, because the statement was accurate in a way that bypassed explanation. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if acknowledging that control had already shifted into a different form without his explicit consent. Emily turned slightly toward the direction of her apartment, then paused before speaking again. "If you are expecting me to behave like the rest of your world," she said, "you will continue to miscalculate." Logan's gaze remained steady. "I am beginning to understand that," he replied. The words were simple, but their weight altered the space between them. Emily did not respond further. She simply adjusted her bag and began walking again, not away from him, but along a parallel direction that did not require invitation or permission. Logan followed at the same measured distance, not leading, not trailing, but maintaining presence without structure. As they moved through the quieter streets, the city noise faded slightly, replaced by the rhythm of their steps and the absence of immediate resolution. Logan Carter, who had built his life on defining systems, found himself walking inside one that did not yet have a definition, and Emily Harper, who had built hers on independence, found herself within a pattern that did not reduce her to either distance or dependence. Neither of them acknowledged it directly, but the alignment between them had already shifted from encounter to continuity, and neither was prepared to classify what that meant. Logan Carter and Emily Harper eventually stopped walking without either of them formally deciding to stop, as if the continuation of their movement had naturally reached a point where silence itself became the only stable agreement between them. The street they stood on was quieter now, the city noise reduced to distant echoes that felt separate from the space they occupied. Logan looked ahead first, then toward her, his expression controlled but no longer fully anchored in the usual structure of interpretation he relied on. "You continue to move as if external pressure has no effect on your decision-making," he said. Emily adjusted her jacket slightly, her voice steady. "External pressure only matters when you accept it as authority," she replied. Logan paused, then responded more quietly than before. Authority is not always something people choose to accept, he said. Emily nodded once. Then it is not authority, she replied. That exchange lingered longer than the others, not because it resolved anything, but because it removed the assumption that either of them was operating under the same definition of control. A faint breeze moved through the street, and for a moment neither of them spoke, not out of discomfort, but because the silence itself had begun functioning differently, no longer empty but structured. Logan finally turned slightly toward her. I have spent my life ensuring that uncertainty remains contained, he said. Emily looked at him directly. And yet you are still standing in it, she replied. The statement was not a challenge, but an observation that did not require correction. Logan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the distance before returning to her. That is no longer avoidable, he said. Emily tilted her head slightly. Then it was never as contained as you believed, she said. Another pause followed, and in that pause the distance between them felt neither increased nor reduced, only acknowledged. Logan stepped forward slightly, stopping at a point that maintained space but eliminated avoidance. You do not respond to hierarchy, he said. Emily answered without hesitation. Hierarchy only matters if you participate in it, she said. Logan considered that for a moment longer than usual, then spoke in a lower tone. Most people participate without realizing it, he said. Emily turned slightly toward the direction of her apartment, but did not move yet. Then most people are not paying attention, she replied. The simplicity of her answer created a shift in the atmosphere between them, not emotional, but structural, as if a previously assumed framework had been removed. Logan looked at her again, not as an evaluation, but as recognition of persistence that did not align with expectation. You are not influenced by proximity in the way I anticipated, he said. Emily responded calmly. Because proximity is not influence unless it is allowed to be, she said. Logan did not immediately counter her statement, and that absence of response felt more significant than any correction would have been. Instead, he looked toward the street again, where distant headlights passed without acknowledgement of the conversation occurring at the edge of their path. Emily finally began walking again, not quickly, not as departure, but as continuation of her own direction. Logan followed at the same measured distance, not reducing or increasing space, but maintaining presence without claim. As they moved forward, the city around them returned to its usual rhythm, yet the interaction between them did not reintegrate into that rhythm. It remained separate, unresolved, and continuous, as if both of them had already stepped beyond the point where their meeting could be treated as an isolated event. Logan Carter, who had always defined systems through control and predictability, now walked within a structure that did not respond to either, and Emily Harper, who had always maintained independence through separation, now moved within a pattern that no longer behaved like separation at all. Neither of them named it, neither of them defined it, but both of them continued forward within it, because at this point, stopping no longer produced clarity, only recognition that something irreversible had already begun.